Good afternoon. I am Phyllis Alongi, and I am a doctoral student in the Transpersonal and Integral Psychology program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and I'm very happy to be here today to present my journal article critique. The article I chose was by Bruce Grayson. It's called The Congruence Between Near Death and Mystical Experience. It was published in 2014. By the International Journal for the Psychology of Religion. So the question now is, why compare near-death and mystical experience? So I'm going to start with a little personal connection to near-death and mystical experience, and why I felt connected to this journal article and why I chose this journal article and was so happy to have it approved so that I could tease it out and critique it and learn more about both near-death experience and mystical experience. So I am interested in near-death experience and have been since 1987. The women in my family are pretty interesting. My mother, in 1987, I was at her house in Manhattan, and my mother was on the corner of 10th Street and 6th Avenue waiting for the light to change when a taxi lost control, a livery taxi, and sped off into the sidewalk and hit my mother waiting for the light to change and hurled her into oncoming traffic, and my mother was hit again. And unbelievably and miraculously, my mother did live. And I waited for her in her apartment with my little baby daughter at the time. And, it was 4 o'clock, then 6 o'clock. And I'm like, where is she? Where is she? And when we got the phone call that she was in St. Vincent's Hospital, which is no longer there, and, I had already known, something was wrong. So when I got to the hospital, I couldn't even recognize my mother. There was no room in the emergency room, and she was on a gurney in the hallway, and I must have passed her 5 or 6 times before I recognized her. I recognized her by one shoe that she had on, and her cheekbone was broken, and her shoulder, and her elbow, and her leg was broken, and she had some broken ribs, but my mother survived. And the point that I want to say is that, she was unconscious for a while, and, for almost 4 days, and that her brush with death really altered her life, the rest of her life, in many ways. But the one way that it altered her life was my mother was then fearless. And, I could talk about this forever, but I'm just going to say briefly, there was a transformative aspect of having a near-death experience for my mother. Many years later, it was then 9/11, September 11th, and we lived, I could see the World Trade Center from my house. And, my mother was the first one out there helping, getting water. She had become fearless. And then years after that, when she was first diagnosed with cancer, she beat it. And for years, she battled for years, but then eventually succumbed to her battle. But the point that I was trying to make is I was interested in this journal article because of my mother. So, and my connection with near-death experience and mystical experience and the qualities, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. So I did want to share that with you, and I also want to share with you, why near-death experience and comparing that to mysticism or mystical experiences. And, near-death experience or altered states during a brush with death are very common and have mystical features, such as a sense of sacredness, a sense of divine union, timelessness, spacelessness, a positive affect or mood, an ineffability, and some noetic quality. So those are the conceptual components of a mystical experience related to near-death experience. And, really anyone is capable of having a near-death experience or a mystical experience. And research tells us that, by comparison, people who have near-death experience are appropriately related. adjusted and, well adjusted. So I think that's really important to note. There's more adequate adjustment in people who have near-death experiences, contrary to popular belief. So for this journal article, why compare near-death and mystical experiences? Because mystical experience and near-death experience are a cross-cultural phenomena. That the study of near-death experiences as are new, relatively new, like 1975-ish to the field as a category, of studies, relatively new. That the underlying factors of near-death experiences are still basically unknown, and that there are life-threatening situations can and may facilitate transcendence and trigger a mystical state, according to Hood in 1977 study. NDEs may be distinct from mystical experience, meaning there may be, let's see, question mark, there may be a distinction between mystical experiences and near-death experiences, and maybe some similarities. Who knows? All right. So we're looking at the hypotheses, and I've realized from taking this course that you have to dig a little because there's usually more than one. One's pretty obvious and maybe stated in the abstract, and then the other hypothesis we have to tease it out somehow. So the first hypothesis, or the primary hypothesis of this study, is that survivors of a close brush with death who have near-death experiences will have higher scores on the mysticism scale than survivors who did not have NDEs. A corollary hypothesis tested, corollary meaning as a result of the first hypothesis, as a result of the study, consequential hypothesis tested, is that the depth of NDEs as measured by scores on the NDE scale will be positively correlated with scores on the mysticism scale. All right, so what is the design? Grayson, author, 2014, conducted, this is a quantitative quasi-experimental study. So there was no control group or placebo group involved. It's quasi-experimental because it does look for differences, and it does look for differences between things, but there was no manipulation of variables. There was no control group or placebo group involved. It was a single factor variable that was tested, and that was NDE experience. The authors did technically control for gender, ethnicity, religiosity, and time elapsed since the incident of that close brush with death. There is no randomization. Participants were self-selected spontaneously from awareness of research study content, so there was no sample recruitment. So I'm really proud of the study design, this diagram, the study diagram. Just taking this course, I learned how to do a study diagram, and I feel like I could take a few liberties, and I used my imagination on what I thought that I wanted it to look like, and so this is what I wanted it to look like. The sample, I felt it was important to note that it was spontaneous contact. So, and we're going to talk about participants in a moment, but I did want to, state that there were 326 participants who made up the sample. And then the measures, there were three. There was an NDE scale, a mysticism scale, and a brief demographic survey. So the first flow, and I look at this study diagram as a flow of the study, and so the next piece to me that was important was the results of the hypothesis 1 and then the results of hypothesis 2, and from those results was a pretty big discussion section, and the discussion section, in the discussion section, what was important to me also was that there was it showed statistical significance for hypothesis 1 and statistical significance for hypothesis 2. So that's my study diagram, and I'm pretty proud of it. Didn't even know what one was a month ago. Okay, So now we're going to talk about the sample. And when we talk about the sample, there's like just something that I want to say is that, you know, as I'm a psychotherapist and I have a private practice. And so just by the you know, feel of who I am as a psychotherapist, I think I attract a certain kind of client. So let's look at that for a second. You know, just by the name of my practice and where it's located and what it looks like and what it smells like, and like when you go on my, you know, my website and you go on Psychology Today, you learn that I, you know, I'm a Reiki practitioner and that I try to incorporate that I, you know, come from a very holistic, very eclectic place as far as psychotherapy is concerned. And so I attract a certain kind of client. Important to mention because this study attracted a certain kind of sample. So let's look at this participant sample. There were, you know, 292 who said that they had a near-death experience within the sample, and there were 34 participants who said that they didn't. Okay, so it was 326 total. There was inclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria was a self-reported life-threatening experience. They emailed and mailed a demographic, you know, by email and regular mail, a demographic questionnaire and the two standardized measures that we spoke about, the NDE scale and the mysticism scale, to the participants who then filled it out and either emailed or mailed the results. And what I wanted to say, you know, about the participants was that they were self-selected based on hearing about the research. And that's important to note now, but we're going to touch more on it. Just like the clients that I attract in my private practice, this research attracted a certain kind of participant, someone who, you know, we'll talk about a little more, what the characteristics were. So what are the measures? Okay, so let's look. There was first, I told you there was the NDE scale, and the NDE scale was self-rated. It's a 16-item multiple choice survey. It had high internal consistency and split half reliability, which is apparently extremely important when you are discussing the validity of a scale. I know that now too. There's 6-month retest reliability as well. And I found a copy of it, so I wanted to post that too because I thought it, you know, just thought that was cool. Okay, so that was the NDE scale. The mysticism scale is a self-rated Likert type scale. Its survey has cross-cultural reliability. And the average score of 4 or 5, this is important. So there isn't anything that really tells us, oh yes, you filled this out, you had a mystical experience. So there was no way to really do that. So if you scored, according to Hood, they used Hood's criteria for a mystical experience. And so if a participant scored if they scored a 4 or a 5, then you made the criterion for a mystical experience. And I also found a copy of that as well. And I feel a little nerdy saying it, but I like that I put those in there. So what do we know? You know, there were no anomalies in the test distribution, by the way. So what did we find out? We found out that, you know, looking at Table 1 and the composite scores, that these are the, let me tell you first that these are the conceptual categories. There's ego loss, unity, inner subjectivity, timelessness, spacelessness, noetic quality, ineffability, positive affect, and sacredness. And if you note by the T-score results here that near-death experiencers, there were 292, scored higher on the mysticism scale. So, and you could look at the p-values here in this composite score, you know, in this table here. Okay, so that was the first piece of the results. What does that really mean? So hypothesis 1, as discussed in that table, that the 292 participants who had a near-death experience had significantly higher scores than the 34 participants who said that they didn't. And we can look at the p-value of that. That's true. True. True meaning statistically significant. I know the difference. Okay. So the results of the scores also indicate and suggest the depth of the near-death experience as measured by the scores on the NDE scale had a significant positive correlation with scores on the entire mysticism scale and on each of those 8 conceptual categories. Amazing. And look at the p-value. Okay, so further, mysticism scores in the sample were significantly higher among women, non-Caucasians. Okay, so let's talk about non-Caucasians. So even though the demographic survey asked you to pick, between different races and ethnicities, they just clumped them into 2. Caucasian, non-Caucasian. So mysticism scores in the sample were significantly higher among women and non-Caucasians and reported closeness to death. So let's talk a little bit about the comparison, confirm the study. The results of the comparison confirmed that the study hypothesis regarding the occurrence of mystical phenomenon in NDEs, the close brush with death, plus the criteria met to having a near-death experience equaled higher scores on the mysticism scale and all 8 of those conceptual categories. So what else can we say? That 66% of the participants who had a near-death experience scored within the range for a mystical experience by Hood's criteria. Remember that 4 and 5. Factor analysis of the near-death experience scale and the mystical experience suggested that near-death experiences have commonalities with, but can be differentiated from mystical experience. And, I think that's amazing. So gender, religious identification, ethnic identification, self-reported closeness to death, and years elapsed from the brush with death, all associated with mysticism scale, not presence or depth of NDE. And that was I think pretty interesting. So this was a great study, and I chose it because I had that personal connection to it, but also because statistically, research speaking, for a novice like myself, it was easier to read than some other journal articles that I have been reading. But, and although I think the research was amazing, and I think it's, shows statistical significance, it is not without limitation. So what are the limitations? Well, we talked about the kind of client that I attract, so let's talk about the kind of participant who would hear about an NDE and mysticism study and want to participate in it. And that's a limitation because people who participated in this study are more likely to have had a mystical experience or a near-death experience. So they were self-selected, no randomization. It was a kind of like an effect convenience sample. So self-selection plus self-reported experiences equals limited generalizability, right? The NDEs who had a mystical experience were more likely to participate in the research. Personal accounts, self-reports, or personal accounts always introduce bias, but let's look at they're vulnerable to memory decay, to distortion, to fabrication. What would I like to see? I thought about how interesting this study was, and what are some of the things that I would like to see or know more about. So I'm going to say for future direction, I would like to know about the different types of NDEs, and how about their correlation to mystical experiences that are distinguished from or in between the different types of near-death experiences. I think that would be exciting. And also to extend the sample beyond this sample, which was like Christian American, and more international, cross-cultural would be amazing. I going back to the very first way that I introduced this presentation about my mother, and I think this is future direction should include the transformative aspects of having such an experience, a mystical experience, a near-death experience, and how it alters and what are the transformative aspects of that for someone. And, to really be able to capture that, in my opinion, would be amazing. And so how mystical experiences and near-death experiences, how do they unfold, in stages of complexity and meaning? And is there any way that we could kind of display that or capture that? I think that that would be a really exciting direction for future research. So, if we can do this qualitatively with the same rigor that we do, other studies, then it could really benefit the field of transpersonal psychology and integral psychology. These are this is the essence of what we want to study, those experiences that are transformative, these exceptional human experiences. So thank you so much for the opportunity to learn what I learned this semester and to see dissecting journal articles through a different lens, from a scholarly critical lens, was an amazing experience for me, and I thank you for that, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for your attendance, your participation, and your attention. Thank you so much.